Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Is this coming through the speakers? How about now? Better? Okay. We've gotten fancy. Apparently the sound system has been in there for years, but nobody told us. So here we are. It's better than holding a mic. Business first. If you would like a copy of the book that we'll be looking at for the next 3 weeks, and whose author will be here on April 10th to sign and give a presentation. If this whets your appetite, we have plenty. They're $15. It's discounted. You can pay via check, cash, or our WeShare account on the website. Grab one today and just mark down an IOU and pay me sometime. And I'll come after you if you don't, I guess. But we do have books available. If we run out, I can order more. It's good to support Father John. Show of hands if you've heard of Father John Deere. Okay. Show of hands if this is your first encounter. Okay, good. We have a good mix in the room. He wrote a book. I'll introduce it in a minute. It's very long. You do not have to read this to participate in this series. You don't even have to own it to participate in this series. I'm letting this sort of be the inspiration for our discussion of some passages from Scripture to look at through a nonviolent lens. So we're going to look at 30 pages of this book, if that, and maybe some other resources. So this is an excuse to talk about the Synoptics and nonviolence. Welcome, good morning. But if you would like a copy of the book, you can pick it up now and bring it back on April 10th to get it signed, or they'll be here on April 10th. But again, you don't need to buy a copy or read it to benefit from this. I'm going to make photocopies each week and upload them to the website and share them via our weekly newsletter. So you can just download them and read ahead if you want, or not. You can still just come, because really the primary text is going to be some passages of Scripture that we're going to look at together and allow Father John and other perspectives to help us imagine a Jesus who is nonviolent and followers of Jesus who make nonviolence their top priority or among their top priorities in the world. Make sense? At the tables, there are handouts. These will be helpful guides through today's session. If you need more, I think we have some floating around. Here are some more if you like. And I will put a box of pens here if you want to take notes. This is all just for fun. There's no test. All right, let's dive in. Pens are right there? Yeah. Sure. All right, here's our agenda. This week, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about Matthew's Sermon on the Mount as sort of a primer on nonviolence, as it were, from a Christian perspective. Next week, we're going to turn to the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to look at Mark's relationship to empire, specifically the Roman Empire, but then we can sort of use that as an analogy for other forms of empire that we may encounter in the world today, and what that may say about our role as the church and as believers and followers of Christ. And then we'll wrap up with looking at Luke, some different passages of Luke, of what Jesus, the peace activist, might look like. Again, using Father John's text as a helpful guide. So we're just going to look at the three Gospels, just a couple passages in each. We're not going to do a deep dive into any of these books, just enough to whet our appetite, and we can always come back. And if we are having great conversations about Matthew and that needs to overflow into next week, then maybe Luke gets pushed out a little bit. I'm not worried about covering a lot of material. My goal here is to have good conversations and facilitate good conversations about the Gospels, to help us be students first of the Word through whatever tools we can use. So today we'll spend a little bit of time introducing Father John Deere and this text, and then we'll spend the rest of the time, the best share of the time, looking at Matthew. Okay. But let's sort of build some momentum. It's your small tables in a minute, just going around. Share as many recent examples of violence as you can think of, from the universal to the personal, okay? You have 1 minute. Go.
Just your day-to-day interaction with people, getting angry.
Yeah.
As a
Yes.
Stop. That's time. Did anyone just sort of hit a silence because you ran out of examples of violence? You just couldn't think of, right. I had a lengthier exercise planned where we'd really sort of take some time to consider all the examples of violence. But then I thought, why watch the news on a Sunday morning? Why do this to ourselves? We're all very aware of how inundated we are, both personally, collectively, through the media, through our own lives, with examples of violence, from the physically violent to emotional violence, to even the violence we cause ourselves to get to work when we're sick or when our boss doesn't understand. Violence that takes place at home, in the workplace, at sports games, at churches, between nations. We don't need to take a lot of time to find these examples. And I assume you wouldn't be here if you hadn't encountered violence in a real way at some point in our lives. In a lot of ways, violence is something that we teach and pass on as a society. We could look at it as something that's sort of natural, but the particular modes of human violence that we encounter, they have to be learned. They have to be taught. They have to be repeated from generation to generation, which is why one of our primordial myths as Christians and Jews is a murder between brothers, is violence. This is the slaying of Abel by Cain, by Peter Paul Rubens. This is one of our founding myths, that two brothers who are competing over honoring God fall into blows, and one kills the other because he perceives that the other is God's favorite. And that's our story. And then we go from that to Jesus, another slaying of brother, or a sort of interfamilial murder, even if we're just looking at the family of humans, or more locally, the sort of local conspiracy that got him killed. We are faced with murder and violence, both large and small, domestic and universal. So that sets us up for how Jesus responds to violence. And through that, since I'm coming at this from a Christian perspective, how Jesus tells us what God's perspective on violence is. Do we worship a violent God? Does God sort of write violence into the universe and expect his followers to make use of it strategically, maybe even regrettably, but it's just the way of things? Or is there another way? And can we find a Jesus who points to a different way? So here are my assumptions. And if you remember our nonviolence series from a couple years ago, you'll remember this. And we're going to begin with this as my founding assumptions for reading this text. And they're assumptions that the text, that is Father John Deere's text, the Gospel of Peace, holds as well. And I'll share these slides if you don't want to take pictures, but feel free to take pictures. First, as followers of Jesus, we are trying to imitate him. This is just sort of what it means, or one of the definitions of being a Christian, trying to do what Jesus did. We all fail, and when we do, we recognize our failures as failures, and we try to do it again. So we're going to talk about ideals when we talk about nonviolence. And we all fail at these ideals. Just because they are lofty ideals does not mean they should be done away with. Right? So something about Christians following Jesus means there's a very high standard, and we're going to fail. But when we fail, we're brave enough to call it a failure and not just sort of settling Second, God's authoritative response to violence, as embodied in Jesus' teachings and actions, is this. It's compassionate, it's active, it's intelligent, and it non-violently resists the evil that takes place in the world. So we see in Jesus, and therefore in God, a compassionate, active, intelligent, non-violent resistance to evil. And we'll talk more about resistance as we get into today's gospel passage. Third, violent and non-violent, and this is language that I've picked up from Father John's book, and I think it's helpful. Violent and non-violent efforts strengthen the cycle of violence. That is, the cycle in which one violent act creates conditions in which another violent act is going to be more likely than it was in the past. Non-violent efforts create friction in this cycle. They try to slow it down, even if it's not going to slow down entirely. What do we mean by non-violent efforts? Well, Father John calls non-violent efforts passivity. That is, attempts to not do any, or refusal to do anything. I don't want to be violent. I don't want to care. So I'm just going to sort of opt out of the system. And he sees this in keeping with people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, two of his big heroes. This kind of nonviolence is really not better than violence. It creates the system of violence by allowing it. That is, by opting out, by saying, well, I'm not violent, so I'm not going to do anything about this. That actually feeds into the cycle of violence. It does not help it. And so people who are non-violent do not get to pat themselves on the back and say, well, I wasn't violent. We're looking for a third way between violence and non-violence, or passivity, resignation, cowardice. And that is creative, active, non-violent resistance, non-violent Christ-like love. So 4, this kind of non-violence is both a practice and an ideal. Possibly, it's an impossible ideal, but it's still a practice. It's something we have to work at. It frames what we do in life and how we understand life. So this kind of nonviolence is not, we're going to avoid any kind of violence to the degree that we're just not going to engage. It's also going to resist doing violence. It's also going to resist receiving violence. So it's creative. It demands more creativity, imagination, courage, and communal effort than either violent efforts or nonviolent resignation. So we're looking for a third way here. And here Father John is inspired by a biblical scholar and activist whom I've long admired, a guy named Walter Wink, who wrote a book called The Third Way that looks at similar themes, Jesus through a nonviolent lens, and I'll be drawing from him quite a bit. So this is where I'm coming from. We're looking for a third way between violence and between opting out that demands our whole response. And when we fail, we'll fail on either one of those sides, and failures are failures, right? We note them, we repent, but neither of the sides is sort of more pure than the other. The failure to be violent is not necessarily better than to do violence. And even Gandhi recognized that possibly there could be times when some kind of violent action is better than not doing anything, even if it is not the ideal. Whether that's the case, that's an open question, but Gandhi seemed to nod to the possibility of a violent response not being the worst thing. So who is Father John? He was born in 1959. He is an American Catholic priest, identifies as a peace activist, a lecturer, and he's written 35 books on peace and nonviolence in his career. He's spoken around the world. He's organized grassroots efforts, demonstrations against war, injustice, and nuclear weapons. He's been arrested some 85 times in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience against war, injustice, poverty, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. He's been nominated several times for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think most recently in January of 2008 by Desmond Tutu. He served as the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and I believe is still the founder and director of the Beatitudes Center for the Nonviolent Jesus. Here's a story that kind of gives you his character, and he's going to come and talk to us and probably tell some stories. So here's just one story. He was a Jesuit. he left the order fairly recently, I think around 10 years ago. But his superior, when he was part of the Maryland province from 90 to 96, recalled a visit from John Deere when, as a Jesuit, Deere was considering joining a protest at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina in 1993. And it was one of a series of demonstrations against nuclear weapons taken by Catholic activists in reference to, they called it the plowshare action, in reference to turning swords into plowshares from the Old Testament. The action saw Deere and 3 others symbolically hammer on a U.S. fighter jet before being arrested, which of course, they're on an Air Force base. And his superior went and visited him because Deere had cleared it with his superior beforehand. It sort of said, I'm gonna go do this thing. Here's why I think it's being consistent with gospel values. And his superior said, okay, you'll be arrested. And John Deere said, of course I will. And then his superior went to visit him in jail afterwards. And Deere served his sentence and got out and continued to do this kind of activism. And his superior, Father Edward Glynn, said this: of course, I was thinking in the back of my head that after we have our first nuclear war, we're going to say, where were we when John Deere and all those people were objecting to nuclear weapons? But John did what Jesuits should do. He got permission, approval from me, and then I visited him in jail. And so I'm sure we'll hear more stories like that from Father John. In 2014, I believe, Father John left the Jesuit order. He expressed not feeling support in his sort of mission of nonviolence. And maybe there were other things too, but there's a nice write-up on that in the National Catholic Reporter. So that's Father John. He'll be here on April 10th. He wrote this book, just came out this year. And it uses the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to see nonviolence as the central theme of Jesus' teaching, especially the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll talk a little bit about too today. So he takes time to work through the entirety of each gospel in a commentary fashion. A commentary is sort of taking the text of a scripture and working through it and interpreting, line by line, passage by passage, giving clarity and exposing, in this case, practical ramifications of what it looks like to study Jesus as a nonviolent activist. But he also interacts quite a bit with the philosophies of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King, along with other peace activists. This is a very practical book, but informed by biblical scholarship as well. It's endorsed by people at Cornell West and Lamott, and other activists in the nonviolent world. So if you want a copy of the book, it's very readable. It's kind of a resource. I would not recommend sitting down and reading it from cover to cover, nor does he. It's handier for maybe looking at the Sunday Gospel and saying, I wonder what this would look like from a nonviolent perspective. So it could be a very handy reference text. Pause there for any questions or insights from those of you who have worked with or learned from Father John Deere before we dive into Matthew. Any thoughts, questions, or insights? Carol.
I conducted a anti-death penalty weekend in Atlanta. I was privileged to attend. So I got to meet him there, and the death penalty is certainly a violent aspect of Tennessee.
It certainly is, and it's a clear example of development in Catholic teaching, which forbids its use anywhere now in the world. How was your experience of that?
Well, I was impressed with his gentleness, and it was a very enriching experience.
Yeah, good. Anyone else? Anyone else meet Father John? Bill?
I went to college with him.
Okay, what was he like in college?
He was one of the regular guys for the first 2 years in our fraternity, and then you could tell a difference came over him in our junior year.
Yeah.
But he was always this John. He was always very intelligent, very well-spoken, very sure of himself, and very, you can tell he does his research. He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, very good. Bill Stewart helped me organize this. He was the one who reached out to me and said, Father John's doing this book tour. I know him. Can he come and talk? And I thought, absolutely, why not? But if we're going to invite him to come talk, we should probably talk about his book first. So here we are. So we're going to turn to some passages in the Gospel of Matthew, and you should have a handout in front of you that has these. I have a few left if you still need one. And this is, of course, one of the most famous parts of the Christian gospel, in which Jesus takes aim at some religious interpretations of what it means to follow God and follow God's law with these phrases, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." So Jesus is taking on a certain kind of authority in possibly reinterpreting or offering a new perspective on ways of understanding Torah, ways of understanding God's law. And my understanding of what this passage is trying to do, and what Matthew thinks he's doing, and what Matthew thinks Christians are, is they are people who go beyond merely fulfilling the letter of the law, which is something that Jews also say we should do. This is not sort of a Christian versus Jewish kind of thing. In fact, Jesus is a Jewish rabbi interpreting the law, but it tries to move Christianity and this understanding of what it means to follow God from a "I will follow the rules" approach. What's the least I can do to not go to the bad place, to not experience punishment in this life? What are the rules that I need to follow so that I have an okay enough life and I can go about doing the things that I really care about? Moving from that kind of perspective, which is very familiar to most of us, I think, we encounter it from time to time, to recognizing that the good news could be, if it is good enough news for us, could be the impetus to creative, nonviolent action in our lives. So from figuring out what are the rules and how do I follow them so I can be a good little boy or girl, to how can I be a transforming force in my world? Whether that's going to be, sort of politically, in political activism, but even and especially in day-to-day life. How do I take opportunities of friction, of conflict, of not getting what I want, these very human experiences of suffering, and instead of either resisting them by increasing the level of suffering or dissociating from them, how do we turn these into opportunity to do something new? How do we engage creatively and courageously? And I think Matthew's contention is you can't do that unless something about, or we can't do that unless something about us has changed. We don't have access to that kind of courage and creativity and intelligence without God's help. And so something about following Jesus gives us that access. Something about hearing this good news and living it out gives us access to a way of life that uses life not just to get by, but to act creatively and courageously in a way that's actually very fulfilling. We're not going to look at the Beatitudes today. We're going to kind of skip past them. But we're all familiar enough with them that Jesus takes experiences that we all try to avoid, and he says, you experience blessing, or blissfulness could be one translation of this Greek term, when these things happen. Mourning, being meek, not being as good as you think you are, as you wish you were, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, being persecuted. These could actually be opportunities for a kind of joy, a kind of fulfillment, if we do it right. That is, if we can figure out how to tap into that. So some of the Sermon on the Mount gives us some examples of what going beyond the letter, so to speak, means. So we're gonna take a look at these. We're gonna start with the end, though. Oh, here's a quote from Jesus in Nonviolence. This is good to kind of summarize what I'm trying to say. Walter Wink writes, "The issue is not, what must I do in order to secure my salvation? What are the rules? But rather, what does God require of me in response to the needs of others? It is not how can I be virtuous, but how can I participate in the struggle of the oppressed for a more just world? Otherwise, our nonviolence is premised on self-justifying attempts to establish our own purity in the eyes of God, others, and ourselves. And that is nothing less than a satanic temptation to die with clean hands and a dirty heart. So the pursuit of nonviolence, it has to be more than about us. We have to escape from the prison of egoism. Otherwise, we're always going to be asking, how nonviolent do I really have to be? Like, when have I been nonviolent enough? As long as that's the story, we'll never be happy. We'll never be effective. So we're going to skip to the end of this passage on the Sermon on the Mount, because in Matthean fashion, he tends to ramp up to a conclusion. He tends to ramp up to where we're going to end up. And I thought we would cheat and start at the end, and then look at how his preparatory comments lead us to this. And what Father John sees as sort of the central thrust of this whole passage, and other commentators agree with him, is this very familiar passage. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes the sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that? Do not the pagans do the same? So be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So for Father John, this is the central pillar of of Jesus' teaching. Loving our neighbor and loving our enemy with the same love. And for Matthew, this gets us back to what we were just talking about. What needs to change about us in order to do this? When this happens, Matthew thinks we become children of God. Right? And sometimes we see this as kind of an analogy or a metaphor, like good people are children of God. But a good bulk of our tradition says no, like God is actually sort of giving birth to God in us. God is actually transforming our spirits into being not other than God, into being like little gods. And Jesus actually quotes later from the Psalm saying, do you not know that you are gods? So this notion of theosis, of divinization, of deification, which is present everywhere in our tradition, here takes on a nonviolent perspective, saying, what does it mean to be birthed by God? It means to look at all humans like God looks at all humans, and to act towards all humans like God acts to all humans. It's easy to do that, I suppose, when you're omniscient, all-powerful, omnipresent. And yet, that is the ideal, and Jesus doesn't mince word here. Be perfect, or differently, be complete. Be whole, just as your Father in heaven is whole, complete, perfect. Somehow, when we parcel out our love according to whatever logic we have, that diminishes us. It lessens our spirits. It makes us less alive, less vital. And clearly for Jesus, he's not concerned whether this gets us killed or not. In fact, he's pretty sure it will. And for him, it's worth it because of the life that gets to live in us. So when God gives birth, we get these Christians. But here, we should see people like Jane Addams or Martin Luther King or Oscar Romero, people who begin to represent to the world God's own image, an image that is seen most clearly in love for enemies. So let's take a minute and at tables, take maybe a few minutes to respond to this passage. Often when I hear be perfect, I go like this. Like one more thing that I'm not doing well. In fact, all the things. So we're sort of hit with this passage. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Love your enemies. So just take a minute to share with one another, as candidly as you can, like how realistic is this? Where do you run up against obstacles? Should we take him seriously? Okay, whatever seems to come up, take a few minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back, okay? Go for it. So Father John Deere calls these the most radical, political, revolutionary words ever uttered. He calls them the most radical words in the entire Bible. And he says, for the last 1,700 years, Christians have done their best to pretend Jesus never said them. He's got opinions. So when Father John reads this, and he sees the word enemy, what does he mean? What does he think Jesus means? Does it mean your disagreeable boss, or your kid when your kid's being annoying? No, he thinks it means the people that your nation or your people tell you are your enemy. He sees this as a command to love the people targeted with death by our nation or our state. Even referring to a nation which is under attack by your own nation. Hence his lifetime of activism protesting things like the use of nuclear weapons, but even the many wars, or not quite wars, that our country has been involved in. Of course, it also must mean for us, the people that we find disagreeable. But for him, that's not the perfection of God's love. Even for me to be okay with my disagreeable boss is not quite, says Father John Deere, what he thinks Jesus is talking about. He thinks that the people called into being to follow him, the church, was meant to see enemies and to see people who are against them and to meet that love with something other than, or to meet that hate with something other than hate, with something like creative, nonviolent resistance to evil. Father John says that Jesus does not say, love your enemies, but if they're really hateful and violent, then you can kill them. There's no exception, no justification, no permission for killing. Killing our enemies is completely forbidden because we are commanded to love them with agape, which is the word used here for love, unconditional love. Which, of course, does run contrary to Catholic tradition. Catholic tradition, which coined the term just war and which used it truly to limit, hopefully limit, some of the kinds of atrocities that would go on in wars in ancient times. But Deere and other scriptural commentators are pretty clear that Jesus did not have just war in mind when he was talking about this. He had something else. And in fact, in his own context, and especially in Matthew's context, a context of civil war, of war in Palestine, war both between Jews and Romans, but also between Jews and Jews, that would eventually lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And we see Jesus either before or through the lens of a post-temple gospel author saying, whatever it means to follow me, it does not mean to take sides on this. It also doesn't mean opt out. It also doesn't mean leave. It means find a way to creatively resist the evil that's taking place. And then he gives some examples, which we'll get to. So this is, again, sort of the central pillar of the gospel for Father John Deere, and the most difficult thing I could imagine telling anyone to do, especially people who have real enemies. I don't have many real enemies. I'm fortunate in that. I don't have people who are trying to kill me, who want people like me to not exist. I'm blessed in that way, I suppose. And so I can't imagine what it would be like to have real enemies, people who would look at someone like me and say, you should not exist. You should definitely not have resources. You should not have rights. And to say, we want to take that away. I could not imagine what it would take to creatively, imaginatively resist that kind of hatred with love. But maybe if it ever happens to me, I'll figure it out, and I can learn from you along the way. So Matthew ramps up to this. Again, we sort of begin with the end here to see what's at stake. But to get there, Jesus offers 5 key reinterpretations of what he says his audience was hearing from their ancestors. Now, in many cases, he's not quoting the Old Testament. In many cases, sometimes he's quoting from interpretations of it, or he is commenting on ways that the Torah had been interpreted. But for instance, love your neighbor and hate your enemy is not in the Bible. That's not a phrase that comes up. So whatever Jesus is quoting there, it's not a straightforward, well, the Old Testament said this, but we're doing a new thing, so we're going to get rid of that. Jesus does not seem to put himself in opposition to the Old Testament in that way. He's offering a perspective, maybe the perspective on what the Torah is for, to get us to a point where we can exercise this kind of creative, imaginative, nonviolent love so that God can give birth in us. So here's the first antithesis. You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment. So if you do this bad thing will happen to you. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, which is a not nice thing to say, which will be answerable to the Sanhedrin. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to fiery Gehenna. What's Jesus doing there? Right, he's using rhetorical language. What's your understanding of what he's saying here? What's the point of his words? Carol?
It's what's in your heart that matters.
Yeah. It's what's in your heart. So he takes this idea that if you do this bad thing, you'll have this corresponding bad punishment. If you kill your brother, there's going to be a really bad punishment. And from that, we should suppose that if we do something lighter, saying, Gino, you're a fool, that the punishment will be lighter. Because that makes sense, right? Killing Gino, we'll ask Jeannie, maybe, is calling him a fool, truly, is calling him a fool better or worse than killing him? It is better, right? We're not insane. Yes, we're not crazy people. It is, by every measurable metric of human reason, saying something not nice to someone is at least slightly better and more preferable, usually to that person too, than killing them, right? And if you don't think so, that's fine, but we're all still alive here. So what that suggests is Jesus is not, in fact, saying we should completely avoid any kind of moral reasoning, and if there is a court system, the punishment for everything should be death. All right, that's not the point. Or that there should be no law whatsoever and everyone should be free. He's trying to get us, as Carol says, to get out of the logic of, if I do this, this will be my punishment, so I shouldn't do that, and I'm going to weigh the punishment and sort of the rulesy, how am I going to be okay mentality. He doesn't think it's going to get us where we need to go. Where we need to go is being like God. And for God, somehow, the decision to kill and the decision to show derision come from the same place, right? So Jesus rhetorically says, killing gets a punishment, saying you fool gets a punishment too. So you don't get to pat yourself on the back for showing derision or for speaking badly against your brother. That's not going to get us to where we want to go. We have to be responsible even for the anger. And then he gives an example of what this means. It would have been very, very clear to people whose primary religious practice was taking stuff to the temple and offering it to God as a sign of, I love you, I'm glad that we're in this covenant, everything is cool between us, which is a good thing to do. It's reassuring. Jesus says, if you're planning to do this, if you're planning to take a sacrifice to the temple and offer it so that you can have sort of this sacramental image of God and you sharing this meal, because you get to eat some of your meat too, but you realize that there's no peace between you and someone else. Your brother has something against you. Not your anger at your brother, but Carolyn's mad at me. Before that sacrament, before that temple sacrifice, that image of the covenant can be real, for that not to be a lie, I have to go to Carolyn and make peace. And then my gift will be what God wants. Then my gift will be a sign of something that's real. Mary Jo.
One of the comments at our table was also, it seems that practice has to be upgraded. We don't just flip a switch,
Right.
Oh, we're now going to be nonviolent. And when I hear this, as you present it, it just seems as though we're also being invited in those little ways to practice over time. And there's hard changes.
Yes, and this is what you hear from people who have been involved in nonviolent activism for a long time. They get impatient, gently impatient, not violently impatient, with questions like, well, what if someone breaks into your home and does these kinds of things? Do you expect me to not react violently? And they'll say, well, if you have been practicing in a nonviolent way, the little things, then maybe your mind will be clear enough to see a solution. Obviously, if this is your first foray into nonviolence and someone tries to jack your car, you're not going to be able to go into this Gandhian mode of, self-love. That's not the point here. And it's not to say if you fail, you're going to hell, right? We're trying to get beyond this sort of, what do I do? What's the punishment kind of perspective? It's to say, if you want to be like God, then however you need to live your life, including like these little micro reconciliations, all of those things will be steps to, if you get to the point where someone wants to nail you to a cross, you're not going to fight against them, which of course is what we worship every Sunday, right? That's the whole Christian mystery, that Jesus goes willingly somehow, while also not saying, and also this is a good thing, right? His torture and death on the cross is not a good thing. It was caused by the state and a political conspiracy, and he doesn't like it. And yet he uses it creatively, imaginatively, to say something really important to his followers and to the world. So I think that's well said. Other thoughts on this reconciliation, anger business? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This isn't an opinion, it's the question. If someone's angry with you and, they think you're a terrible person, and that's fine. I mean, some people think I'm a terrible person. And say horrible things about me behind my back. I mean, I remember going to a priest years ago and saying, this is not good. What do I say? And the response from this priest was, take yourself out of slapping distance. And just when you see that person, say, we're finally getting the rain we've been missing, and how are your children? And that's it. And it creates an opening for the other person, but your expectations are not, this is, she's finally going to see a wonderful person. Why would they ever say those horrible things about me?
Yeah.
So my question is, being reconciled with your brother, what does that mean?
That's a great question, because we know that there are relationships and situations where there will be no peace on the side of death, right? Situations of abuse. We can't imagine, and we could never ask a victim of different forms of abuse to have to reconcile if God is going to love that person. That's not what we're saying. That's monstrous. In fact, demanding forgiveness makes it not forgiveness, right? So I think what's being asked here is we remember this third way idea. It is a third way between violence on the one hand, which could be if someone thinks I'm a terrible person, well, you're a terrible person right back. And that's my motivation. And also checking out or being afraid or trying to get out of the situation, trying to pretend like it doesn't exist. It does demand that third, courageous, creative kind of, I don't know what it will be because every relationship is different. And so what we can't do is give platitudes or rules. Nonviolence, as Mary Jo points out, it's a practice. It is a way of seeing the world and therefore seeing our enemies and learning how to see them in ways that cause us less suffering and hopefully decrease the suffering that they're going through. But it's more like a commitment over a long-term commitment than it is a once and for all, I've decided to forgive this person and I don't have to think about it anymore. And in fact, most real acts of forgiveness take time, right? And they continue with micro vows of it, like, I forgive you, but then I see you again and I'm still kind of angry. So I have to decide again to offer that forgiveness and over, and maybe it doesn't end, until something about it changes. I think it won't end until there's justice. But I also think justice is something that God must provide. Without God, without some kind of intervention into history, most of the kinds of wounds and wrongs that have been done to people who have really good cause for struggling with forgiveness, I think it takes a miracle to do that. I'm thinking of people who have suffered rape. I don't know what it could possibly mean to be reconciled with one's rapist, on this side of life with everything going on. And to make that kind of demand to say, if you're a real Christian, then I think that's monstrous. What it is a commitment to a future reality in which possibly even rapists are healed, right? I don't know what that looks like. And it takes a lot of imagination to conceive of a reality where people can do really awful things and be reconciled, but that's kind of Christianity. That's kind of the promise, the whole point of the thief on the cross, or the idea that anyone can repent, also means in the end, when we're all together in the resurrection, somehow the abused and their abusers can not only tolerate one another, but share a glass of wine. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like. All I know is I can't get there right now, So maybe we start with just not being unkind while we protect ourselves from further hurt, because we are called to resist evil. Most relationships with abusers, resisting that evil means stepping out of the relationship, and that is necessary and good. So nowhere in any kind of nonviolent discourse, never hear a demand for those who have suffered to sort of take it, right? And John Deere is very clear about this. This is resistance to evil. This is not, the hostage? Stockholm syndrome or masochism. This is none of that. It's a third way. Thanks for the comments. Rose, you had a thought.
As we were talking about that third part, so then, and I'm sure all of us are going to feel this in the next several months before election day. So if you have people that you disagree with, so I have family members, extended family members that we're on different political sides. Our way to deal with it is to not talk about it. So is that nonviolence? Is that avoiding of the conversation? Being passive or cowardly? Or is that just, hey, this is just how we're going to get along?
Yeah. What a great question. I don't know. And that's, again, the reason that this is so inspiring to me, and I'm realizing we're running up on time, but I'm really enjoying this conversation, and we'll pick up where we left off, is that there are no big answers to these kinds of things. I can't just say, yes, you should always engage with your relatives around politics because cowardice is bad, because sometimes, Uncle Stan is going to blow up and deck me if I use pronouns or whatever. the point of this is we have to be in communities that will actually help us to talk about these things. So not just, I have this example, but what would it be like for a table to sit down and talk about Uncle Stan and how I feel when I talk to him? And then I can learn from people who have been in these kinds of situations. Well, maybe you could try this. Because we're talking about creativity, we're talking about imagination, because that's what, like, the fight or flight thing that we're trying to escape, what it shuts down are options, right? When you're in fight or flight mode, how many options do you have? You have 2, right? So we are trying to access some third way, some third force, some way to pause the fight or flight activity, which is natural and good, because I don't want to get eaten by a tiger in the jungle, but to pause that long enough to really creatively look at the options. Maybe Uncle Stan needs a hug. Maybe he needs a sharp word. Maybe we don't know, but the point of this is that it takes small communities, it takes actually working through our real experiences with a little bit of courage and imagination to figure out what real nonviolence looks like, because it depends on my abilities. If I haven't been doing this for long, then I probably can't Gandhi out and say something wise and quippy. Maybe I do need to check out, but maybe even the words I use to say, hey, you know what, Uncle Stan, I can see that we're not going to agree on this. I think that your views are monstrous and I'd love to talk about that someday, but I'm going to go in the kitchen. Maybe that's what I need to say because that's our relationship. Or maybe I need to be super kind. It all depends, which is maybe not very satisfying. But this isn't supposed to be something that we learn and go do. This is something that we practice and we test and we fail at it, right? I was trying to be nice to Uncle Stan, but then he said the wrong thing, so I decked him. I'm going to try not to do that anymore. It's bad. But the hope is that even in our failures, there's good that can be drawn out of it. That in these relationships, there's more creativity, there's more imagination, because the vision of God this gives us is pure, creative, nonviolent activity. There will always be a third way. If we can't access it, then we do it again. Someone once said, there are no mistakes, only lessons, right? And part of this is a nod to, we all have to learn to do this. And we don't need to go to the Air Force Base right now and hammer on jets. Maybe that's not where we need to be. I don't know what it takes to do that. But there is somewhere in our life where there's conflict, where there's friction, where someone has something against us, that if we were just a little more curious and creative in a community, because we got to talk about this stuff, and if we take care of ourselves through good therapy sometimes and learning to be more mindful, all these things fit together in just being in the world in a different way, where it's not fight or flight, but it's being here on purpose, looking for these opportunities. We're going to pick up with the next antithesis next week, and then hopefully we'll get into Mark. But thanks for your attention. Come grab a book. I'll write your name down, and we'll keep going.